Welcome to Energy Insights. In today's episode, we speak with Janna Smith about all things renewables growth, challenges and opportunities in Southeast Asia. We talk about topics including Southeast Asia's renewable potential, where countries are doing well, what countries are leading, and the challenges associated with accelerating clean energy growth in the region. Janna is a researcher at Global Energy Monitor, or GEM for short, and contributed to one of its latest reports titled A Race to the Top, Southeast Asia 2024. It was great to have Janna on the show, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Okay, we're here with Janna Smith. Janna, thank you so much for coming on Energy Insights.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So before we get started in the episode, Janna, I'm just wondering if you can give us a brief background on who you are and where you're working right now and what you're working on in particular, if there's anything.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Janna. I'm a researcher with Global Energy Monitor, also known as GEM. I've been conducting research with them for just over 2 years, mainly on solar and wind development, and then particularly in Southeast Asia. And so I guess what we're talking about today is a report that we released focusing on wind and solar development in Southeast Asia. It's part of a series that we do called Race to the Top. And so we just look at what that buildup looks like and provide more context. And a little bit about Global Energy Monitor is we provide data on various energy sources. We have coal, gas infrastructure, hydropower, geothermal, and solar and wind. And this data is used as like an international reference point for various organizations, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, for instance, the United Nations, and also the World Bank. And then it's also used by industry data providers such as Bloomberg Terminals and The Economist. And then because it's fully open access, anyone can go to our website and download the data. Universities use it, academics, and also just civil society.
Awesome. Now, I think I do want to talk about that report on Southeast Asia's renewable developments, but I think it's worth, for example, right now, if we mention why Southeast Asia is so important when we're speaking from a global context in terms of energy. So I guess from your vantage point, what makes Southeast Asia so important with the energy that it produces and consumes?
Southeast Asia is quickly becoming a hub for economic development, and they also have an increasing population. And so this means that they're needing more energy to meet both of those demands. And for a little context there, between 2015 and 2020, the global energy demand increased by about 16% as an average across the world. But for Southeast Asia specifically, it grew by 22%. And it's likely to continue increasing because of this economic and population development. And so this means that Southeast Asia is kind of at a crossroads for how that energy development can be met. It can use fossil fuels, renewable energy, and also energy imports. And so with the world aiming to triple renewables, Southeast Asia can play an important part in getting us there because of some significant prospective capacity, which I can talk about a little bit later. And it's also important to remember that in kind of the context of climate change, that Southeast Asia is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And this is something that we're all already seeing. With flooding, droughts, changes in monsoon seasons. And so they're really at the front lines of the energy transition, not only in being able to develop their renewable energy capacity and change their kind of energy profile, but also because it's something that they're already experiencing there.
Now, in the report, it mentions that ASEAN, which is, of course, the consortium of Southeast Asian countries, they have a renewable energy target. So I'm just wondering if we could talk a little more about that and I guess touch on what growth has been like in terms of renewables across Southeast Asia.
So the energy target that we focus on in the report is that ASEAN has a goal of producing 35% of its energy capacity from renewable sources by 2025. And so that's an average across all ASEAN member states. And they're currently at 32%. And this breakdown includes sources like bioenergy, geothermal, hydropower, and solar and wind. We've seen a 20% increase in the solar and wind capacity that's been added in ASEAN countries since 2023. And so they have just under 30 gigawatts of utility scale solar and wind currently in operation. And just like a baseline for context, 1 gigawatt of renewable energy can provide enough electricity for about 1 million homes. And that's just blanket across all countries. So there's a little bit of nuance that can be added because the demand changes with the consumer. But hopefully that provides a little bit of context. So when we're looking at this goal, it's important to remain kind of critical of what that target is. And so because they're so close to it, they're at 32% now, and they only need to get to 35% in the next couple of years, or 2 years essentially. They can do that with solar and wind because of the perspective and operating capacity that they have. And so they only need to add an additional 17 gigawatts of utility scale solar and wind to meet that. There are some complications with that number, though, because the region currently has only 3% of their prospective capacity in construction, and that's below the global average, which is at about 7%, barring China. Another kind of challenge of this energy target is that we can look at it as being kind of relatively unambitious. Because they're so close to it, we have to wonder why that's, maybe it was set too low, for instance. And this also, because it's an average across all the countries, it allows for countries that have lower operating capacity to kind of be supported by those that are working really hard at meeting their targets.
Now, there's one thing in the report that I found particularly interesting, for example, is that the mention of Southeast Asia's offshore wind potential compared to, say, its onshore wind potential. Now, this is, of course, a overall good thing, but there have been issues, for example, in other parts of the world in rolling offshore wind out. I'm just wondering if you can foresee some similar challenges for Southeast Asia if countries try and scale up their offshore wind.
So just for a little context, for ASEAN countries, they have almost 5 times more prospective offshore wind than prospective onshore for the region. And this is pretty significant because, like you said, of the challenges associated with offshore wind development. And some of those are, it takes a lot more investment. The timeline for putting those projects into operation is longer. And then it's a really new industry that's affected by changes in the supply chain, which has also been a global challenge with supply chain disruptions. And so they currently only have 2 gigawatts of operating offshore of their total 9 gigawatts of wind capacity. And so it's still a very new sector, but it can be supported mainly through transparent policy that countries are able to roll out that provide a roadmap for investors and developers of these projects to bring those into operation. And there's also, growing interest and concern about the impact that offshore wind has on communities that rely heavily on fishing and on that coastal line access. And again, these are things that can be facilitated by greater involvement in community development for these projects as well. So Southeast Asia is definitely not isolated in terms of how they're impacted by these challenges.
Are there any, for example, one thing that jumps to mind right now is I wanted to get your thoughts on, are there any, for example, countries that are in Southeast Asia that are leading the pack, so to speak, in terms of how much renewable energy output they are producing, for example? Is one country or a few countries doing better than the others?
So when we think about kind of standout countries in Southeast Asia, we look at both their current operating capacity, but also their prospective capacity or the potential capacity that's kind of already on the table, either through financial announcements, but also projects that are moving through regulatory bodies to go into construction and then further operation. And currently in Southeast Asia, Vietnam has the largest operating capacity with just about 20 gigawatts. And then Thailand and the Philippines in second and third place also have about 3 gigawatts each. And then in terms of perspective, we see kind of a really big jump. The Philippines has 99 gigawatts. Vietnam has just about 85 gigawatts. And so that puts them in the top 10 for global perspective capacity. But there's also a standout of Laos, as they have a relatively large perspective capacity in comparison to the size of their economy. For instance, they have about 3 gigawatts in perspective capacity, which is what Thailand has currently in operation, but Laos just only a fraction of the size. Their economy is only a fraction of the size.
Yeah, in the case of Laos, for example, I recall in the report that it hasn't got that much perspective capacity it has, but in terms of actual generating electricity capacity right now in terms of renewables is quite low. I'm just wondering why that's the case.
Yeah, so Laos currently has a pretty substantial amount of operating hydropower in comparison to its solar and wind development. And this is largely, you can see this across most Southeast Asian countries. This is a really new sector. And Laos, it's landlocked, but they do have a lot of potential. And they have a lot of potential to also foster partnerships with other Southeast Asian countries to export their renewable energy. And so because of this, developing these partnerships, their renewable energy sector, particularly for solar and wind, has been expanding pretty rapidly. There's ongoing negotiations with Singapore to create kind of underwater energy cables to be able to provide Singapore with solar and wind capacity. And so, we're seeing that across Southeast Asia, is that there's a lot of excitement and a lot of buildup of perspective capacity. There's over 200 gigawatts in the whole region because it's a new sector, and there's hints in policy that this is something that countries can prioritize.
And now I just wanted to, shift a little bit to some countries in the region that aren't progressing particularly well, according to the report. Now, there are some major economies that aren't rolling out renewables, at the speed of say the Philippines or the Vietnams of Southeast Asia. I'm just wondering what your diagnosis is on why this is the case. Why are some countries, falling behind in terms of renewables capacity and generation?
Yeah, so every country has a unique approach to their renewable energy sector. And so I think we can all agree that comparing, for instance, Brunei and their energy capacity buildup to Vietnam, for instance, can be an unfair comparison because the size of the country, the potential, and then also the economy looks really different. But when we look at countries that have larger economies and more active renewable energy sectors, that's where we can look at why the buildup is moving relatively slowly. And if we look at Indonesia, for instance, which is a country that has the largest economy in Southeast Asia, but they only have a fraction of their energy sector comes from renewable energy. And part of this is because of the prioritization of fossil fuels in their energy policy that's made it difficult for for solar and wind developers to feel like they are welcomed into the sector. And then we've also seen very low construction rates for projects across Southeast Asia. And part of this is also, there are hurdles with grid infrastructure, but also the way that policy is relatively unsupportive of the buildup of renewable energy as a priority for the energy transition. An example of this is countries Indonesia, Philippines, and also Vietnam, which are kind of the countries that we would expect to have the biggest renewable energy build out, are prioritizing the use of gas infrastructure as a transition fuel from coal-based power to renewable energy. And this doesn't, this sends mixed messaging to solar and wind developers as to how their projects will be effectively integrated into the grid.
Do you think that, for example, the recent JET-P deals that I know Indonesia and Vietnam have just signed on for, do you think that these will change what you've just mentioned in terms of giving different signals to solar and wind developers in those countries that are more, I guess, looking towards transition fuels like gas and of course other fossil fuels?
So I can just briefly go over what the Just Energy Transition Partnerships are, just to kind of how we've defined it in the paper. So there's kind of two parts to these partnerships. There's the financial part, which is the partnerships with G7 countries that provide private, public loans, and then also some grants. And then there's also the just element of these partnerships, which requires the active participation of civil society and environmental experts and activists in developing programs and systems to effectively move forward with an energy transition so that people and their perspectives are involved so that it can be supportive of everyone, facing climate change, for instance. And so during the process of setting these up, because it's an ongoing process, nothing set in stone at this point for either Vietnam or Indonesia, there's a lot of possibility for funding around updating infrastructure. And Vietnam also, in some of their recent policies, have stated that they're prioritizing integrating solar projects that are kind of on hold at the moment as part of their Just Energy Transition Partnership negotiations. But at the same time, there have been a lot of delays in these negotiations, and part of that is because of the continued support for their fossil fuel industries. And so Indonesia, for instance, or Vietnam, and their international partners must make clear, focused, and ambitious goals to address the energy transition.
You mentioned their infrastructure, and I think that brings me to, I guess, it makes me think about aging grids across Southeast Asia. And of course, this is not a problem that is unique to Southeast Asia. I think aging grids are an issue elsewhere in the world, whether that's in the US or whether that's in Europe. So I'm just wondering what are your thoughts on how countries in Southeast Asia, for example, can I guess address this issue of aging grids to basically get the electricity to the people?
It's really important for countries in Southeast Asia to provide clear and supportive policy around the renewable energy implementation. And this also requires being transparent about what the grid infrastructure challenges are for investors and developers of these projects. And so something that has been a deterrent, particularly in Vietnam, is that there are projects that are not operating at full capacity because of the need for improvement to the grid infrastructure. And so it's important for these countries to prioritize renewable energy in their grid over fossil fuels, which has been kind of the precedent and how their grids have been operating up until this point.
Janna Smith, thank you so much for your time. And I'm just wondering, before we sign off, I'm just wondering if you can give listeners a way to follow your work or either Global Energy Monitor's work. Is there anywhere that you would like to point them to go?
You can find Global Energy Monitor on the internet, globalenergymonitor.com. If you're interested in any energy information, we have a lot of it. So yeah, please read the report and the future ones that we put out.
Thank you so much, Janna. It was a pleasure to talk to you. If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.